men and women ought to practice head coverings differently to reflect different gender roles given by God at creation. But someone will say, I believe male headship is based on God's created order, but the head covering tradition was based on first century cultural norms or first century circumstances, and these don't apply anymore to us in the 21st century. That's why in the 21st century we still affirm male headship, but we don't express male headship in the first century way with head coverings. But that's not what Paul wrote at all. Paul explicitly connected headship and head coverings. We can't divide headship and head coverings. Verse 3 introduce the respective heads. Christ, the head of man. Man, the head of woman. God, the head of Christ. Headship of Christ over man, headship of man over woman, headship of God over Christ. Then in verse 4 to 5, the connection was made between the head covering practice and what happens to one's respective heads. Verse 4, every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head, but every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. Paul explicitly connected headship and head covering. How can we divide headship and head covering? Paul explicitly connected the principle of headship and the practice of head covering. Where did Paul write anything in this passage that proves he divided the principle from the practice? That's problem A. Problem B. Paul explicitly connected head coverings to creation, not first century culture, nor first century circumstance. Look at verse 7 carefully again. For a man ought not to cover his head. Notice carefully, Paul explicitly referenced the actual head covering practice itself. For a man ought not to cover his head. And so what's the reason for these head covering practices? Verse 7, for a man ought not to cover his head, since in first century Corinth it was disgraceful. Is that what Paul wrote? Verse 7, for a man ought not to cover his head, since by first century Greek or Roman cultural norms it was disgraceful. Listen to other alternatives. For a man ought not to cover his head, since Roman men covered their heads in pagan worship. So Christian men must do the opposite and uncover to make the difference between Christian worship and pagan worship clear to see. Did Paul write that? How about another alternative? For a man ought not to cover his head, since in pagan temples and in the Jewish temple, men and women were separated into different spaces. So in church, there must also be a way to differentiate between men and women, not by the space they can enter, but by their different appearance. Did Paul write any of that? False option after false option fills our sermons and books and blogs and commentaries. What did Paul actually write in his letter to the Corinthians? Verse 7, for a man ought not to cover his head. And I repeat, Paul explicitly referenced the actual head covering practice itself. For a man ought not to cover his head. Why? Paul's real reason is coming now. Since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. Allusion to Genesis 1 verse 26 to 27. Creation. Verse 8. For man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Allusion to Genesis 2 verse 21 to verse 23. Creation. Verse 9. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. Allusion to Genesis 2 verse 18. Creation. Paul explicitly based the actual head covering practice itself on God's very good creation in the beginning. Genesis 1 and 2. Not first century culture, not first century circumstances. Now a few more false options for verse 10. That is why a woman ought to have authority on her head because of female modesty, to prevent outsiders from confusing Christian women with adulteresses and prostitutes. That is why a woman ought to have authority on her head because of female modesty, to prevent Christian men being sexually aroused by the exposed long hair of Christian women who are praying and prophesying in church. That is why a woman ought to have authority on her head because Christian prophetesses should look different from pagan prophetesses who prophesy with their heads uncovered and hair all messy. Verse 10. That is why a woman ought to have authority on her head because in first century Roman culture, wives wore a veil. So married Christian women should look like married Roman women. Basically, all these alternatives are just saying that is why a woman ought to have authority on her head because of first century culture or some first century circumstance. Did Paul write any of that? That is why a woman ought to have authority on her head because of the angels. Not because of modesty, not because of the culture or the religious practices of Jews, Greeks, or Romans. You realize, amazingly, besides God, Christ, and other Christians, the only other group that Paul referenced to were the angels. And besides God's created order, the only other reason for these head covering practices that Paul referenced were the angels. Head coverings has got nothing whatsoever to do with the culture of the first century world or the opinions of its people. The actual head covering practice itself was based on God's very good creation. It was not based on the culture of the first century, nor the peoples of the first century. And if there's any other reason, it's got to do with angels. It's got nothing to do with the humans or our culture or our circumstances. Since the apostle did not mention any of these false options, we ought not put words in his mouth and misrepresent him and misrepresent God's will, which is written in his word. Let's stick to Paul's actual reasons, which were written down explicitly. Paul explicitly connected headship and head coverings. We can't divide headship from head coverings. There is not a single verse that allows us to do so. Paul explicitly connected head coverings to creation, not first century culture, nor first century circumstance. There is not a single verse that points in those directions. And since the apostles' head covering tradition is based on God's created pattern for the first man and first woman, it applies to human beings descended from the first man and first woman. In other words, it applies to all human beings. It applies no matter which people group you are from. It applies no matter which culture you grew up in. It applies no matter which century you live in. Man and woman ought to practice head coverings differently to reflect different gender roles given by God at creation.